Okay, so now that we have finished the modeling section of the class, we're going to move into materials, textures, shaders, and then in conjunction with that, lighting and cameras and rendering. It's all kind of together. Today we're really just going to focus on applying preset materials in Renderman, and we'll probably also start talking about cameras and lights. We're not going to get into textures. We're not going to do any UV unwrapping this semester. And we're only going to kind of briefly talk about rendering. We're not going to do any finished rendering today. But what you have in front of you is a not entirely finished car, but it has some finished components. It will get us where we need to be as far as something to which we can apply materials. So last week, and I didn't actually post this video because it was kind of a jumbled mess and we're not using the internal renderer anyway. Last week I did talk about kind of the basic applying of materials with the Maya internal software renderer. So by default, it renders with its internal render engine. When I say render engine, what that's referring to is the series of calculations and formulae and algorithms that Maya uses to determine what your scene looks like. And these various algorithms can define what a surface looks like, what color is it, how does light bounce off of it. They can define how light falls off. You know, as light travels across a distance, it will fall off or its intensity will decrease. And you can tell Maya how that fall off is going to work. You can also tell it how exactly to render it as far as resolution, the dimensions, the aspect ratio, all sorts of things. So by default, a Maya render, and actually let me really quickly add a ground plane. I like to add ground planes just because it gives the light something extra to bounce off of. So by default, Maya will render and it will look like this. And that's crappy. I don't like it. Now, if I change that render engine, I'm going to my render settings and changing that to Renderman, and now I hit render. A new render window is going to open up, and it's going to look a whole lot nicer. It just, the lighting feels more natural. Already behaves a little bit better. Things are smoother. Renderman will apply the smooth preview to the render, and it gives you a lot more power. So this is what we're going to be working with this semester for our final renders in both still and motion. So let's dive in. And the first thing you need to know is how to get Renderman. To get Renderman, if you Google Renderman or search engine of your choice, okay, this is the website, renderman.pixar.com. You can see they use Renderman on a bunch of different things, including Star Wars, Rogue One, and Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales. You know, this is Pixar's Renderman, meaning this is the render engine that Pixar uses to do Pixar things like Finding Dory and whatever this adorable thing is, Piper, apparently. To get Renderman, you can try it for free, but there also will be a link to the non-commercial version. So free non-commercial Renderman, you sign up, create an account, you register, and download it and install. It's all a pretty self-explanatory process. It's pretty quick. I seem to recall it being a decent size download, but again, it's free. All you have to do is sign up, and I think it's well worth it. Once you sign up, you may need to enable that as a plugin. So to do that, you go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and scroll down to almost the bottom. And here is the Renderman section. It says Renderman for Maya. You want to make sure it's set to loaded and auto load, so it will automatically be there every time you launch Maya. So that's how you get Renderman. Now let's talk about kind of how to use it. So you saw me very briefly switch into Renderman, but I'll actually walk through that at a slower pace right now. So To render with Renderman, you need to tell Maya that that's the render engine that you want to use. And you do that through the render settings. So you can either go to Windows Rendering Editor, Render Settings, or you can go to this slate with the gear icon right up here, Display Render Settings. That brings up our Master Render Settings window. We can see when we switch from Maya Software to Renderman, we get a bunch more tabs, which means we have a lot more options. We're barely going to scratch the surface of what Renderman can do. Okay, this again is a professional renderer that has a ton of different options for a ton of different applications, and it's kind of outside the scope of what we need. But even in its simplest form, Renderman is awesome and can do a lot. So don't be intimidated by the scope. We can make it manageable and usable for our needs here. So with render settings, this first, I guess it's the second drop down, render using is how you define what you're going to use. So Renderman is what we want. And then we have 6 tabs. Common is your most important. Common settings. We've got apply output transform to renderer. File output is an important one, so you can give a prefix to the file name. Image format, so we've got ones that you're probably familiar with, like, well, I guess TIFF is probably the one that you're most familiar with, but there are various other Targa, various other image formats. Probably stick with TIFF. They used to have like JPEG and PNG in here too. This is Renderman version 21.3, which I've not worked with. I'm working on a slightly older one at home. But you can choose your image format. You can choose how you want the file format to be listed. If you're doing multiple frames, you're rendering an animation, then you also need to incorporate the frame number into the file name. And you can do that in whichever way you prefer. If we scroll down a little bit, frame range, again, that will only apply when you're doing an animation. If you're just rendering a single frame, it'll render whatever frame your time slider is on at that moment. Renderable cameras. So right now it's set to perspective. So however I move my perspective, okay, it will render that view. Once you add a camera, you need to tell it to render with that camera. You might think that would be obvious. Maya and Renderman do not make that assumption. You have to tell it explicitly. You can also choose to render with an alpha channel, with a depth channel, Z depth, which will allow for depth of field effects, things being out of focus. Image size, we've got some presets for image size. If you scroll towards the bottom, we've got, not too far. Here we've got HD, 540, 720, and 1080, so that's full HD. I'm going to keep it at 540 for now. Pixel aspect ratio, which should be just fine where it is. You can also manually enter your resolutions if you want something custom. Resolution is 72 pixels per inch, which is standard for digital displays and TVs. If you're doing print, then you'd want something closer to 300 ppi. We also have device aspect ratio and pixel aspect ratio. Again, the default should get you where you need to be. Then we've got some other things, other options that we won't have to worry about. That's just the common tab. Again, that's the majority of your time spent in the render settings is going to be in the common tab and in the second tab, which is sampling. Sampling is your quality. Okay, so we can set the quality of the render based on this sample number. Okay, and we've got a few additional options which I don't want to worry about right now. But the samples is how many times it calculates the light for a given pixel or part of the frame. So if I just hit render right now, oops, I hit it and then I hit it again because I'm impatient. That's not what I wanted. That's John. There we go. That's what I want. So if I hit render, you could see it had a bunch of little blue boxes. Those little blue boxes are called buckets, and that's a section of the frame that Maya is rendering at once. Okay, but on each of those buckets, I've told it to take a maximum of 128 samples. If I bring this down to something really low, like 16, and then I tell it to render again, okay, it's going to be a little bit grainier. If I bring up my catalog, I'll go through exactly what I'm doing here in a little bit, but if I cycle through the before and after render, you might not be able to see this on YouTube with the compression. So let me do something even blockier, even lower quality. Okay, you see all these little speckles, this noise in the shadows especially. As we change the number of samples, that noise will increase or decrease. Okay, and right now with a really simple scene and everything is the same basic material, you're not going to notice a ton of difference. But as we start adding more materials, and especially when you get to doing transparent things and things that are glass, fluids, caustics, then you really need to bump those samples up. We also have IPR samples. IPR stands for something that I always forget what it means. IPR means progressive rendering. So it's a very cool feature in Renderman. It works great. If you're adjusting a material or a light and you're just making little tweaks and you want to be constantly updated without having to completely hit re-render every time, instead of doing a regular render, you can do an IPR render, okay, interactive progressive rendering. And so now, as I change my view around, and I need to tell this to always be on top so it doesn't go away when I change my view. Oh, and it's still, sorry, I have to close the window and then relaunch it so that it stays on top. There it goes. Okay. Oh, nope, still not staying on top. Well, it's just lying to me. So I'll just do it over here. But as I change my view around, you can see that it is automatically re-rendering. And so I can set my render quality or my samples to two different numbers depending on if I want to, if I'm doing IPR, I probably don't need it to do the full, 128, 512, whatever samples that I would do for a finished render. I can almost certainly get by with fewer samples for IPR. So that's why those are in two separate sections there. Okay. Integrator refers to how light is behaving in the scene. We'll keep it at the defaults for now. I don't know what Russian roulette is. I have not looked that up. Default ray depths. So that's how much light's going to bounce around and pass through objects. Filter as well. Incidentally, if you, on the Renderman site, there is a ton of documentation for Renderman 21 and all the Rendermans, but there's a ton of documentation, and we'll take you through everything you need to know, what all the controls do, what all the options are, everything like that. There's also some video tutorials on getting kind of up to speed with Renderman and some more advanced stuff. So if you really want to get into it, by all means, dive in. You can do some really awesome stuff with it. So that's the main things for the render settings. You can also, you can turn on motion blur in the features, which is nice. Adds a little bit of extra realism. You can do additional passes, so you can render various passes on your scene. So you could render just the shadows, and then you could render just the main scene, and then you could render just, for depth of field, and then you can composite them in afterwards, which gives you a ton of control on how exactly you want your final image to look. Advanced, I don't think we're really going to deal with, there's some hair options. Not really going to deal with anything there. And workspace we're not going to deal with. So those are the main, again, common and sampling are where you're going to spend most of your time in the render settings. Once you have that set, I'm going to click on this little button right here, which is going to open up my render view. And that's the wrong render view. This this render view is the Maya internal renderer, which works fine, but the Renderman one is much better. So I'll actually just hit Renderman render, and it'll bring it up. Okay. So here's our render. And I've got a few additional things loaded in, or not loaded, but activated. So if I go to my window menu, I have the catalog and the inspector activated. I also have always on top, which should keep this window always on top even when I click over into Maya. Oh, there it goes. It didn't work last time, but now it's actually working. So I can screw around in Maya, but still I'll have my window here, which means, especially if I'm doing an IPR render, let me open that up. There we go. Whoops. Why did that go away? Come back. There we go. All right. So especially if I'm doing an IPR render and it doesn't work for IPR. Weird. I wonder if that's a bug. Well, it should always stay on top, but either way. On the catalog side, I'm going to do a regular render for this. The catalog will keep track of all of your renders. So let's say you're tweaking camera angles and you do one render like this. You can hit escape to stop a render, okay, before it completes. And then maybe I move my view around and maybe I want to kind of zoom in a little bit. Then I hit render again, which R is the key command for render if you're in the IT browser. Now it will render the next one. And what I can do is I can compare previous renders. I don't have to tell it to save the image. I can use the arrows up and down, and it'll still keep rendering my current frame, but I can refer back to the last frame, which is great for tweaking materials and cameras and lights and all of that. On the other side of the window, I have the inspector. And the inspector tells me things about the render. It tells me what the resolution is, the bit depth. It tells me how many samples. So in this case, it's 512. It tells me the render time, 21 seconds, which is exceptionally fast for a still frame render. I want you to start being... Don't be surprised if your renders get into the 15, 20, 30 minutes per frame. Okay, you can tweak that and adjust the samples and do all sorts of things to optimize and speed things up. But if you want a really nice high quality render, let it take a half an hour. And that's still on the low end. I've had single frame renders that take a couple of hours. You know, if you want something that really looks nice, it will take time because it's calculating all sorts of different light rays and caustics and, you know, whatever else you have in the scene. So know that going forward, as especially when we get closer to deadlines, that you can't just show up 20 minutes before class and expect to get 5 renders knocked out. If you do, they'll look terrible, and I'll know. So plan ahead. You know, it's not uncommon that I'll set up something to render and just let it render overnight. Hit render before I go to bed. In the morning, it's done, assuming it didn't crash, which usually it doesn't. But that happens too. If something crashes during a render, don't wait till the last day to render. Give yourself a head start. But I've got all of those options over there in the inspector. Another note about the kind of renderer is you'll notice that this is technically a different application. It's the IT render view. I don't remember what IT stands for. It just says it. So, but this is a slightly different viewer window, which gives you these options. You've got a few other options. You can export the file, which is basically saving it out as an image. Catalog, which is, again, this side here, you've got a few options. Image, hit R to render again. You can hit escape to cancel the render. You can toggle the background. There's also, I can't remember where it is. I'll find it when we get to it. In the view, this is nice resize window to image. So if you're rendering an image this size and you don't like seeing that extra space, you can tell the window to be just the size of what you need. Let's see. Is it select object tool? Is that what I'm looking for? No, I guess not. Sequence. Image color space display view. Okay. Oh, this is actually an important one. If I go back to catalog here, we've got a burn-in mapping on save. So this gets a little bit into the color space of the renderer. But in practical terms, if as you save something out, the saved file looks darker than what it looked like in the renderer, it's because it's basically saving out a raw file, you know, like a DSLR would take a raw file. It's basically saving one of those out, and you have to tell it to not save out the raw version, save out the version that has the color applied, which is mostly what we'll be doing here. And I think that's just about it as far as things that I want to cover here. Yeah. Okay. So that is the basic overview of the controls for Renderman. You can also, by the way, you can save these sessions. So I could save this catalog and come back to it later. I don't really do that a lot, but you certainly can. The last two things to mention, we have a Renderman tool shelf up here. And this has some of your most commonly used options. So we've got render current frame, IPR render, how to start both of those. We also have some light options. So if you right click on these, you can see different options. You can add a rectangle light, add a disk light, distance light, sphere light. If I right click here, we've got a dome, portal, environment. Again, I'll go over these in more detail later, but just know if there's a little arrow next to it, it means there's more options there. We can also apply materials. You can open the image tool. That's what it stands for, image tool. So you can open the IT browser just by clicking on the eye there. You can also open up a list of your lights, all sorts of things. And then lastly, actually, no, we'll come back to that. We've got the Renderman menu, which is up here. And again, there's a lot of repeat commands here. So we've got render and IPR render. We've got render settings. You can add various Renderman. So Renderman is not just materials, but it's also lights and some additional things. And then the last thing I want to cover is this preset browser. So you can get to it either with, in the Renderman menu, preset browser, or you can click on this little guy right here, open preset browser, and we'll open this up. So this is what we're going to primarily be dealing with today. And this is a list of all sorts of pre-made materials that look great out of the box. So there's preset environment maps, which we'll talk about shortly. Preset light rigs. So these are multiple light setups that you can just drop right in. And there's a bunch of preset materials. So there's acrylics and ceramics. There's composites. So this is carbon fiber. We have fabrics, glass, liquids, metals of various types. We've got this nice hammered copper material, metallic paints, minerals, Teflon, paint, resin, plastics, rocks, rubber, and wood. Okay, ton of different presets that we will be applying here shortly. So that's the very general overview of Renderman. Now let's actually start adding some things.